Okay, so today you are going to watch these notes on land-based empires in the Middle East, Asia, and Russia, and their ultimate downfall. So traditional land-based powers had problems that challenged their authority and economic welfare. We see all these uprisings and revolutions take place throughout Europe, throughout the Americas, and it pretty much creeps its way into Eurasia as well. So all four land-based empires that we looked at the beginning of this unit, the Ottoman, the Qing dynasty in China, the Russian Empire, Japanese under the Tokugawa shogunate, had very unsuccessful confrontations with the Western empires because industrialized nations had stronger armies and navies. They just had more technology, they had better weaponry, etc. So Europe and the US forced them to make concessions that set up better business and trade arrangements. We discussed this with the Opium Wars in China, the creation of spheres of influence. The Ottoman Empire at this time was known as the sick man of Europe, and the Europeans are kind of chipping away at it. And then, as we'll see with the Japanese, the United States go into Japan and force them to open their ports because the Japanese see the Chinese example in the Opium Wars, and because the Japanese had not yet industrialized, they also open their ports to trade with the Americans, which ultimately leads to the downfall of the Tokugawa shogunate. Japan is the exception here with the fall of the land-based empires, because although the Tokugawa shogunate falls, we see the rise of the Meiji, who overthrow the Tokugawa after they make the deal with the Americans. And so the Meiji rise to power. They rapidly industrialize. Japan is able to industrialize in 40 years. And then they take on their own imperial pursuits throughout the Asian sphere and the Pacific sphere. So all four empires suffered from population pressures, failing crop production, they're losing money, and so it's difficult to fund a strong military. They all have corrupt governments, we see rebellions by peasants, and they were open to Western intervention and had a disadvantage when dealing with the foreigners because they aren't fully industrialized, because their governments are weak. So attempts are made at reform. We see the writing of new constitutions, we see limiting governmental power, restructuring education, all which we're going to discuss in the following slides, and then also making an effort to industrialize. So the Ottoman, the Russian Empire, and the Qing dynasty are all in crisis, and as I mentioned on the previous slide, Japan under the Tokugawa was the exception. They're, after the Meiji overthrow, they're on their way to becoming a major world power. Okay, so the decline of the Ottoman Empire. 1750, the Ottoman Empire is in decline. Remember, they conquer Constantinople in 1453, and so they are ruling from Istanbul up until 1750, continuing through, but in 1750 is when we really see the decline. They have a lot of land holdings in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and North Africa, but they reached their peak in the 16th century under the leadership of Suleiman the Magnificent. In the 18th century, we see sultans having problems keeping the empire united, and a good chunk of this has to do with this rise in nationalism during the 18th century. Especially in the Balkans and in their Eastern European holdings. The era is characterized by conservatism and a reverence for tradition, which keeps them from advancing technologically. So there's not as much of an emphasis on industrialization, and this really hurts their economy, and it hurts them politically as well, because they're not able to keep up with the West. In the early 19th century, the Ottomans couldn't combat European economic involvement or prevent loss of territories. Egypt declares their independence under the leadership of Muhammad Ali. Although still tied to the Ottoman Empire, they declare their independence. And then France goes in and occupies Algeria, and European states are capturing northern and western territories. So the military weaknesses and territorial losses. The Ottomans had always depended on their strong military. If you remember, the emperor's janissaries, right, a strong military elite who were loyal only to the sultan. But by the 17th century, they had reached the limits of their expansion, and they're slow to adapt to new military technology. And we see a serious breakdown in the effectiveness of the janissaries. The janissaries still have a lot of political sway because they are an elite force. They are very wealthy. But they're just not as effective as a military unit. The Balkans are very vulnerable due to the rising Russian power in the 18th century, and nationalism is working against Ottoman unity, as I mentioned earlier. So we see independence movements in Greece, and Greece gains their independence from the Ottomans in 1830, and then also in Serbia, which is in the Balkans, in 1867. So because of that nationalism in those areas, if you remember, we talked about the creation of nation states, and nationalism is a way for people to come together based on these common bonds of religion, language, territory, history, etc. And so they get their independence from the Ottomans. And so this is just continuing to weaken the Ottoman Empire. In North Africa, Napoleon invades Egypt in 1798. This sparks a lot of competition among the Egyptian elites for control. And as I mentioned earlier, Muhammad Ali ends up becoming the leader. Napoleon does invade, but then he has to go back to France because his power is being challenged. And so Muhammad Ali is able to build a powerful army, and he implemented lots of military reforms, and he starts to industrialize, in particular with the cotton industry. Cotton is a major crop that's grown in Egypt, and the cotton industry becomes very successful. Even today, Egyptian cotton is ultra fancy and luxurious. People love it. Foreign investment plays a big role in modernization with the building of railroads and the Suez Canal. By 1882, the British occupy the area of Egypt, and so they take control of that area and trade between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea through the Suez Canal. Okay, the Crimean War and reform. Between 1853 and 1854, we see the weaknesses of the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Russians attack southward in Crimea, and this threatens Ottoman lands. So the British and the French send troops to help protect the Ottomans. Russia is defeated, but it shows the weakness of the Ottoman Empire needing protection from stronger powers. So the Russians are super weak as well because they haven't fully industrialized. So they are unable, because they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the railroads, they don't have the weapons and the supplies to send to their troops in Crimea, and so they are defeated by the Ottomans and the combined power of the Ottomans and the British and the French. We see the Crimean War as a real turning point in warfare. It marks the transition from traditional to modern warfare with lots of new types of technology being used, and because of this, we see the casualty rates being very high. Before the war, there's lots of efforts made to reform by Sultan Selim III, which is based on the Western model. The Janissaries don't like this. They don't want things to change, and so they revolt and they kill new troops and capture the Sultan. And then he dies. Sultan Mahmud II takes over, and he revives the reforms, and he's actually able to be successful. And so these reforms focus on military and education. After this, Islamic leadership loses power. Sorry about the typo. It should be Islamic leadership loses power. So the reforms that follow Mahmud are the Tanzimat reforms. Now, Tanzimat means reorganization, and this lasts until 1867. These reforms are secular reforms, and so they substitute French legal codes for Sharia law. They guarantee public trials. They give right to privacy and equity under the law, though marriage and divorce were still determined by Sharia law. And a state ministry of education is created, and so we see an increase in public schools and public education for both boys and girls. Religious conservatives don't like the Tanzimat reforms because they want Sharia law back, because under this the ulama, or the Islamic scholars and the scholar elite, have a lot of control over the law. So radicals seize power in 1876 and give the throne to Abd al-Hamid II and made him sultan. Once in power, he suspended the constitution and then ruled autocratically until 1908. And just to go back really quickly with the Tanzimat reforms, they're secular reforms. However, under Sharia law, women had more rights. They could inherit property. They had the right to divorce their husbands. With the Tanzimat reforms, all of these rights go away. So women actually lose rights under the Tanzimat reforms. Sorry. Okay. Opposition groups begin to protest the despotic rule, and the most well-known is the Young Turks, who were formed in Paris by Turks who were exiled because of their resistance to the Sultan. And so this inspires Turkish nationalism, and they want to restore the Constitution of 1876. In 1908, In 1908, we see a successful coup, which forces the Sultan to restore the constitution. And a year later, the Sultan's dethroned, and then a new Sultan was named. However, he's powerless. By 1900, the Ottoman Empire has lost a significant amount of territory and becomes known as the sick man of Europe because of their failure to westernize and industrialize, and because the people are in constant turmoil. Okay, moving to China. So 1750, man, it's a hard year for everybody. In China, they're strong in 1750, but by the late 18th century, they begin to decline. So 1750 is kind of like the beginning of the end for the Qing dynasty in China. There's corruption within the government. The exam system becomes corrupt. Revenues going into the pockets of bureaucrats. There's no money for public works projects. There's food shortages. Vagabonds are roaming the countryside. There's bandits. And so it's viewed that the Qing have lost the mandate of heaven, and it's time for a new dynasty. Now, the Macartney expedition. So the European and Chinese clash. There's a delegation led by George Macartney, who is a British diplomat. He's there to open trade between China and Great Britain. Under the Chinese Canton system, trade is severely restricted, and Europeans are only allowed to trade in China in the port of Canton, aka Guangzhou. The ethnocentrism on both sides made it so that they couldn't agree. Now, ethnocentrism is when one ethnic group believes that they are superior to all others. And so, as we know, the Chinese view themselves as the Middle Kingdom. They think that they are the best. As we also know, the Europeans think that they are the best. And so they can't find common ground. This leads to Macartney going home with nothing. And ultimately, the Opium Wars. We have discussed this in our imperialism notes, but I'm going to go through it one more time. So England's technologically superior to China. There's a trade imbalance between the Europeans and the Chinese, and so the Europeans want to fix that because they have an unfavorable balance of trade. They're importing lots of goods from China, but they're unable to export or sell any goods to China. And so that the way that they try to change this imbalance is they find opium in their colony in India, and they introduce it to the Chinese. How nice. They smuggle it into China to try to get the Chinese population hooked on it. Opium is very addictive, and many in the Chinese government protest the trade because of public health concerns. From the early 18th century, the Qing emperors forbade opium. It is illegal. At one point, they try to round up as much opium as possible, and they throw it into the sea. They're trying to get rid of it. They burn opium pipes, all unsuccessful. The emperor blockades Guangzhou and confiscates the opium, and the British said that this is stopping free trade, and so they declare war against China. Now, the Qing couldn't defeat Great Britain because, again, as we've said numerous times, the British have industrialized and have superior weapons, and the Chinese do not. So this leads to the unequal treaties. After the war, the Treaty of Nanking is signed, where the Europeans force the Chinese to dismantle the Canton system. They increase the number of ports that they open to foreigners, and the British are allowed to conduct business under British law while in China. This is called extraterritorial rights, where the British don't need to follow the laws in China. They follow the laws of Great Britain, so they can basically do whatever they want. The Qing had to pay 5% tariff on imports for starting the war, because they didn't want the British to continually flood their shores with opium. China is forced to guarantee Britain the most favored nation status, and because of this, the treaties become known as the unequal treaties. By 1900, Chinese ports are carved into spheres of influence, and they're controlled by designated foreign nations, most of these being European. So that leads us to the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion is led by Hong Xiuquan. Sorry for my pronunciation. He's a Christian from the Guangxi province, and he leads a movement called a Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace. Now, his objective is to drive the Manchus, who lead the Qing dynasty, out of China. So if you remember, ethnic Chinese people are not fond of the Manchus, who have come in and taken over China from the Ming dynasty, just as ethnic Chinese were not fans of the Mongols during the Yuan dynasty. Now, he amasses a large amount of followers, by claiming to be the little brother of Jesus. So this is also a